Welcome to the channel Learn with Danish. Subscribe and hit the bell icon. Hello all. In the previous video, we had a discussion on the American school of criticism, which is known as New Criticism. In this video, we would be focusing another school of criticism, which is known as Russian Formalism, which actually was a kind of mother root to the new critics of the American school of criticism. So let us just look into what Russian formalism is all about. Before we get into the school as such, I would be stating out how it emerged, what are the different kinds of analysis that was prevalent in the European context, because Russian formalism is basically a European school of criticism. And I would be focusing on what were the schools of criticism that they were opposed to. So it is a European school of criticism, as I said earlier, and it spanned from 1915 to 1934, starting in Russia and migrating into Czechoslovakia and places nearby Russia. That's Prague and all. 1915, in the sense, I'm not concentrating on that year itself, because it's just a small assumption that we come across that it began in the early period of the 20th century and by 1934. Why 1934? Because after 1934 we see that Russia was actually ruled by Stalin, and we have the coming of a kind of social realism in literature, a kind of propagandistic mode of analysis in literature. So before this Russian formalism actually came into existence, the mode of analysis of literature was basically based on the sociological, psychological perspectives. Right. We had the emergence of the Marxian theory, as well as we had the establishment of a Freudian psychoanalysis. Even though it happened in the 1920s, but still it had an influence on. And along with that, we had the symbolism that emerged in France, which focused on the kind of impressionistic way or subjective way of analyzing literature. So these three kind of valuation, that is sociological, psychological, or symbolist method of analysis, was prevalent just before the Russian formalism came into existence. It was a reaction against these schools in Europe. So it was also influenced by the famous structuralist, Swedish linguist Ferdinand de Saussure. So when you look at the Russian formalist, we see that the early formalist focused on the sound inside the text. As one more thing I would like to say is that these Russian formalists never wished to address themselves as formalist, because they consider that derogatory name to be something kind of bureaucratic, or which is quite ineffective to their kind of criticism, because they assume that we need to analyze literature as the text, as inside the text itself. So earlier formalists focused on sounds inside the text, basically the phonemic or the linguistic study or the analysis of literature. And later on we have the inclusion of literary devices coming into the text for the analysis. So we see that the Russian formalist approached literature in a kind of scientific manner, which was not seen in the analysis of literature beforehand. Right. So that was the prime important feature of Russian formalism. So some of the major critics that is involved with Russian formalism, that is, I would be taking on my lecture into four elements that I had mentioned in my earlier video. I'd be focusing on the background, then the major critics involved with the school of criticism, then I would be focusing on the general features of that particular school of criticism, then at the end I would be concentrating on some terms associated with that school of criticism. So in Russian formalism, we have critics like Roman Jakobson, who actually migrated to the Prague linguistic circle later in his life, and who was a contributor of Opoyaz. Opoyaz is considered to be the journal of a Russian formalist at the early stage. Then we have Boris Eichenbaum. Boris Eichenbaum is also a person who actually tried to inculcate science and dominance of literary devices in literature, science into the study or the analysis of literature. Then we have Victor Shklovsky. Victor Shklovsky is involved with certain terminologies in Russian formalism. His essay, Art as Technique, written in the year 1917, is considered to be a masterpiece related to the formalist approach of criticism. Right. So we have another critic who is known as Vladimir Prop. Vladimir Prop is actually a folklorist and who analyzes Russian folk literature. He is also associated with terms that's related to Russian formalists in content, right? And the last one we have Jan Mokrovsky. Jan Mokrovsky has commented on the literariness of the text as such. We'll be coming into that detail in the last part of the session. Right. So let us just look into the general features of the Russian formalist. So as I said, the first feature is that Russian formalists treated literature or the study of literature in a scientific manner, and they focused on the text as such. The focus was primarily on the text as such. And the poem should be treated as a linguistic whole. Linguistic whole in the sense a poem should be treated as the text itself. Poem per se, that is the American philosophy basically. So poem is for its own sake. T.S. Eliot, philosophy of objective correlative, all come into play in this Russian formalism. The form or the structure is given more importance than the content or meaning. So Russian formalists actually come in terms with form and content. They say that the good literature should have an extended delay in conveying meaning. For example, writings of James Joyce, writings of Virginia Woolf, when you come across those writings, especially we see that Victor Shklovsky in his essay Art as Technique commented upon a work that is written by Lawrence Sterne, a 17th century novelist who actually wrote a huge volume, a nine volume book, which is called Tristram Shandy. Tristram Shandy is the work that he highlighted in his essay Art as Technique, and he says that there should be a kind of defamiliarization that should come into the text, which creates a kind of analysis where the reader is supposed to be just a reader and the text is considered to be the most important thing. So you cannot understand that meaning at one reading. So content is actually subsidiary in nature of analysis with regard to Russian formalism or formalism as such. So literature has a special kind of language. They also focus on that. That's also a prime point that they focus on. Just like the new critics, they also say that literature has a separate kind of language, and that language is different from the practical or ordinary language. And that language is what makes the literary text more literary. So the object of study is actually the literariness of the text, according to the Roman Jacobson. The early formalists focused on sound as such, as I told you earlier. Later on, we have the coming up of devices. Now, focusing on certain terminologies associated with Russian formalism, the first terminology is literariness. Almost all Russian formalists focused on this term, literariness. Now, what is literariness? According to Roman Jacobson, the object of study in literary science is not literature but literariness. That is what makes a given work a literary work. Roman Jacobson, in his essay Linguistics in Modern Criticism, states this particular statement. So it is not anything else. So the literariness inside the text is what is to be analyzed. How much literature is in it can be analyzed only through literariness. So it's kind of device that can be used in analysis. Literariness is the term used to identify the language used in literature. Now, another term that's associated along with literariness is foregrounding and backgrounding. You might have heard of backgrounding, even you might have also heard of foregrounding, but in Russian formalism, foregrounding is often associated with giving importance to the text, foregrounding the text. They consider foregrounding the text and backgrounding the content inside the text. That is the meaning inside the text. That was basically put forth by the critic who's called Jan Mukrowski, and he described literariness as consisting the maximum of foregrounding the act of expression or the act of speech itself. That is basically the text as such. So foregrounding the text is what is meant by the process of literariness, according to Jan Mukrowski. For the formalist, of the text or the form is foregrounded, or what is in simple terms given importance. The content or meaning is backgrounded. The next term that's associated with Russian formalism is defamiliarization. Defamiliarization was coined by Victor Shklovsky in his essay Art as Technique, written in 1917. It is a duty of an artist to make strange the familiar through literary device. And literary device that he suggests is actually deviation. The term that he uses is deviation. Through deviation, we create something that is familiar. So literature should not be just the representation of the real life as such. There should be some kind of deviation in a representation. That is, the story can have a logical sequence as such. Along with defamiliarization, he comes on with Fabula and Shuse also, and I would be talking about it in the next slide as we move on, but you should have a general idea. Fabula is the story concerned inside the text. The story is basically chronological sequence of events, and Shuse is the plot. The plot is the narrative employed in order to tell that story. So in the narrative, you should have certain kind of digressions, pauses or twist, or some kind of literary devices should be used in order to defamiliarize the reader from the text. So that is a technique that is used by Victor Shklovsky. The deviation is explained through Fabula and Shuse in his work Art as Technique. Now, what is Fabula and Shuse? It was also used by Vladimir Prop along with Victor Shklovsky. Victor Shklovsky used the two terms to explain defamiliarization in his essay Art as Technique, and it is also used in narratology. Basically, it focuses on a narrative technique. So what is Fabula? Actually, Fabula means the story. That is the chronological sequence of events. So in Lawrence Stern, Tristram Shandy, we see that this is a biography of Tristram Shandy, and each event in that biography is interfered with the commentary that is of the reader. How one should read that event is explained in detail after each event in that work. So there is a sudden break, sudden pause that's deliberately used by Lawrence Stern, according to Victor Slowski, in order to create the defamiliarization effect, or in order to create the Shuse effect. The Shuse here used is the narrative style of interfering the commentary inside the text. He has used many plagiarism. He has referred to many Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. Lots of works are mentioned with words, passages that's completely copied from the former text, but still that coordination that he uses by using several literary devices, especially that of digression, is what Victor Sklowski stresses on. And he says that Fabula and Shuse plays a significant role in analyzing literature. So Shuse, the narrative technique, or the employment of narration inside the story, is what is known as Shuse. Shuse is a plot. It deals with how the story is organized, or it deals with the employment of the narrative. Shuse, according to Slowski, should have digression, twists, pauses, etc., in order to make the fabula defamiliarize. He uses the example of Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy. I don't think you can completely read that work because it's a huge work. 17th century novels are considered to be huge, bulk novels. So basically, that is a general idea about Russian formalism as such. Hope you have understood what Russian formalism is. I have not discussed in great detail of what Russian formalism is, but I have just given a basic introduction to the school of criticism. So whenever you are trying to learn a school of criticism, you can learn in that four element perspective. So I hope that this video is helpful for you guys. Till then, it's me, Danish, signing off for our next video. Have a good day. Learn with Danish.